In the winter of 1874, 17 people died in what the Colorado Territorial Government officially recorded as mining accidents in the remote settlement of Copper Ridge. But the truth, buried in forgotten territorial archives and whispered testimonies from survivors who fled to Denver, tells a far more disturbing story. These weren't accidents. They were murders orchestrated by a conspiracy so twisted that it involved deliberate deception about the most sacred of human bonds, family itself. The deaths began exactly 3 weeks after Martha Kellerman discovered that the man she had been married to for 2 years, the father of her infant daughter, was not who he claimed to be. Before we continue with the story of Copper Ridge and the horrifying secret that tore this mining community apart, the investigation that followed Martha's discovery would uncover a web of lies that stretched back over a decade, revealing how desperation and isolation can drive ordinary people to commit unspeakable acts in the name of survival. Copper Ridge sat like a scar on the eastern slope of the Colorado Rockies, 11,000 feet above sea level and 43 miles from the nearest settlement. In 1872, when prospector Samuel Brennan first discovered copper deposits in the area, the location seemed blessed by fortune. Within 8 months, nearly 200 souls had made the treacherous journey up the mountain trails, drawn by promises of wealth that seemed to materialize from the very rocks themselves. The town that emerged was a testament to human determination and desperation in equal measure. Wooden structures clung to the mountainside like barnacles on a ship's hull, connected by narrow boardwalks that creaked ominously under the weight of men hauling equipment and supplies. The main street, if it could be called that, consisted of the Copper Crown Saloon, Hendrix's General Store, a makeshift church that doubled as a schoolhouse, and the assay office, where men brought their daily hopes to be weighed and measured. But Copper Ridge suffered from the same affliction that plagued countless mining settlements throughout the Colorado Territory, a severe shortage of women. Of the nearly 200 residents, fewer than 30 were female, and most of those were either married too young or too old to be considered marriage prospects. This imbalance created a social tension that simmered beneath the surface of daily life, manifesting in everything from fistfights over perceived slights to men paying exorbitant sums just to dance with a woman at the monthly social gatherings. The isolation was absolute during winter months. Snow could fall as early as September and remain until May, cutting the settlement off from the outside world for weeks at a time. During these periods, the population turned inward, creating their own social structures, their own rules, and as events would later prove, their own twisted solutions to problems that civilized society would never countenance. Among the residents was Martha Kellerman, formerly Martha Sinclair, who had arrived in the summer of 1872 as part of a wagon train that included 3 other unmarried women. Martha was 22 years old, possessed of auburn hair and green eyes that seemed to hold depths of intelligence and determination that impressed even the most hardened miners. She had come west from Illinois after her parents died in a house fire, carrying nothing but a small inheritance and an unshakable belief that the frontier offered opportunities denied to women in more established communities. Within 3 months of her arrival, Martha had received no fewer than 14 marriage proposals. She turned them all down, instead establishing herself as the settlement's unofficial teacher and taking up residence in a small cabin behind the church. Her independence was both admired and resented by the male population, who saw her as a prize to be won rather than a person to be respected. It was in November of 1872 that she first encountered Thomas Kellerman, a soft-spoken man in his mid-20s who worked claims on the northern ridge. Unlike the other miners, Thomas approached Martha with respect rather than desperation. He spoke to her about books, about the world beyond the mountains, about dreams that extended beyond, striking it rich and returning east. He never pressed his suit, never demanded her attention, simply made himself available for conversation whenever she seemed inclined to talk. Thomas claimed to hail from Pennsylvania, orphaned, young, and raised by an uncle who died when Thomas reached majority. He spoke with a slight accent that Martha couldn't quite place, but assumed was some remnant of his Pennsylvania upbringing. There was something familiar about his mannerisms, the way he held his head when listening, the particular laugh that emerged when something truly amused him. But Martha attributed these feelings to the way isolated communities sometimes created false intimacies among their residents. Their courtship lasted through the winter, conducted in stolen moments between Martha's teaching duties and Thomas's work in the mines. He proved to be intelligent and well-read, able to discuss literature and philosophy with a depth that surprised Martha given his rough exterior and callous hands. More importantly, he treated her as an equal, seeking her opinions on matters both trivial and profound, never once suggesting that marriage would require her to abandon her role as teacher. They were married in April of 1873, in a ceremony that served as much as a community celebration as a religious service. The entire population of Copper Ridge attended partly out of genuine goodwill, but mostly because any excuse for festivity was welcomed in their harsh environment. Martha wore a dress made from fabric, ordered specially from Denver, while Thomas appeared in the finest suit that could be procured in the territory. The early months of their marriage seemed blessed. Thomas proved to be a devoted husband, gentle and considerate in all things. Their small cabin became a haven of domestic tranquility in a settlement where violence and rough behavior were commonplace. When Martha announced her pregnancy in late summer, the joy seemed complete. But even in those happy months, there were moments when Martha felt an inexplicable unease. Sometimes she would catch Thomas staring at her with an expression she couldn't interpret, not lustful or romantic, but something more complex and troubling. There were conversations that he would abruptly terminate when certain topics arose, particularly anything related to his past or family. And there were nights when she would wake to find him sitting by the window, staring out at the moonlit peaks, with a look of such profound sadness that it made her chest ache with sympathy. She attributed these concerns to the natural adjustments of marriage and the stress of their harsh environment. After all, every resident of Copper Ridge carried secrets and sorrows that had driven them to seek new lives in such a remote location. Thomas's reticence about his past seemed no different from the guarded nature displayed by most of their neighbors. Their daughter, Elizabeth, was born in February of 1874, during the worst blizzard in living memory. The birth was difficult, complicated by the high altitude and lack of proper medical care. For 3 days, Martha's life hung in the balance while Thomas paced their cabin like a man possessed, refusing all offers of help or comfort from well-meaning neighbors. It was during Martha's recovery, as she lay weak and exhausted, but grateful to be alive, that she first began to suspect something was terribly wrong with her husband's story. The discovery came about through sheer accident, the kind of random occurrence that changes lives forever and reveals truths better left buried. On March 15, 1874, while organizing their few possessions to make room for the baby's cradle, Martha found herself examining a small wooden box that Thomas kept among his personal effects. She had noticed it before, but had never presumed to open it, respecting his privacy as he respected hers. The box had fallen from a high shelf when she accidentally knocked it while reaching for blankets. It struck the floor with enough force to spring the latch, spilling its contents across the rough wooden planks. As Martha knelt to gather the scattered items, a few coins, a pocket watch, some papers, her hands suddenly froze. Among the papers was a the kind taken by traveling photographers who occasionally made their way through frontier settlements. The image showed a family group, a stern-faced man and woman flanked by 2 children, a boy and a girl, who appeared to be about 10 and 8 years old, respectively. The boy bore an unmistakable resemblance to Thomas, but it was the girl who made Martha's blood run cold. She was looking at her own face. Not a similar face, not a remarkable resemblance, but her exact features captured in the silver-tinted, glass of a photograph that had to be at least 15 years old. The girl's hair was lighter, her face rounder with youth, but the eyes, the nose, the particular way her lips curved. It was undeniably Martha herself as a child. With trembling hands, Martha examined the photograph more closely. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written, "The Sinclair family, Chicago, 1859. Robert, Mary, Thomas, and Martha." The implications hit her like a physical blow. Thomas Kellerman was not who he claimed to be. He was Thomas Sinclair, her brother, who had supposedly died in the same house fire that killed their parents. The brother she had mourned, whose loss had driven her west in search of a new life, had been alive all along. Not only alive, but deliberately hiding his identity, courting her, marrying her, fathering a child with her. Martha's first reaction was to doubt her own eyes. Perhaps the photograph was of strangers who happened to bear a resemblance to her family. Perhaps her grief and isolation had caused her to see patterns that didn't exist. But as she studied the image, memory after memory crashed over her like an avalanche. The familiar laugh she couldn't place, the way Thomas held his head when listening, the particular gestures that had seemed so comfortable and right. She remembered now that Thomas had been sent to live with their uncle in Pennsylvania when he was 14 after a series of increasingly serious behavioral problems. Their parents had hoped the change of environment would help him, but communication had been sporadic at best. When the fire consumed their Chicago home, the authorities had told her that Thomas had perished along with their parents. His body burned beyond recognition, but he hadn't died. Somehow, he had survived and made his way west, adopting a new identity and a carefully constructed history. And when he encountered her in Copper Ridge, he had recognized her immediately, while she, changed by years and distance, had not recognized him. The questions that followed this realization were too horrible to contemplate. Had he come to Copper Ridge specifically seeking her, or had their meeting been coincidental? If he had recognized her from the beginning, why hadn't he revealed his identity? Why had he courted and married her, knowing full well that she was his sister? And perhaps most disturbing of all, what did this mean for their daughter Elizabeth, the innocent child born of an unknowing, incestuous union? Martha spent the rest of that day in a state of shock so profound that she could barely function. When Thomas returned from the mines that evening, she watched him with new eyes. Seeing past the familiar facade to the stranger beneath, every gesture, every word, every casual display of affection now carried a sinister weight that made her stomach churn with revulsion. But she said nothing. Some instinct for self-preservation warned her that revealing her knowledge too hastily could be dangerous. If Thomas had been capable of such elaborate deception, if he had been willing to commit what both law and scripture deemed one of the most heinous of sins, then she could not predict how he might react to discovery. Instead, she began to observe him more carefully, looking for additional evidence to confirm or deny her suspicions. She studied his face when he thought she wasn't watching, searching for traces of the brother she had known in childhood. She listened to his stories about his supposed past, cataloging the inconsistencies and contradictions that she had previously overlooked. The evidence mounted quickly. Thomas knew details about their childhood home that he could only have learned by living there. He unconsciously hummed songs that their mother had sung to them as children. Most damning of all, he possessed a small scar on his left hand that Martha remembered from when they were children, the result of an accident with their father's wood-carving knife. 3 days after her discovery, Martha made a decision that would ultimately lead to the deaths of 17 people. She confronted Thomas with the photograph. The conversation took place in their cabin after they had put Elizabeth to bed. Martha placed the daguerreotype on the rough wooden table between them and watched as Thomas's face went through a series of transformations: surprise, recognition, fear, and finally a kind of resigned acceptance. "How long have you known?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, what?" Martha replied, though they both understood the game was over. Thomas picked up the photograph and stared at it for a long moment. "I was 17 when the fire happened," he said. "Finally, I wasn't in the house. I was in trouble again. Bad trouble this time. I was hiding in the old mill by the river, scared to come home and face Papa's anger. When I saw the flames, when I realized what had happened," he paused, struggling with emotions that seemed genuine despite everything. "I thought everyone was dead. I thought you were dead. But I wasn't," Martha said. "And when you saw me here, you knew who I was. The moment I laid eyes on you," Thomas confirmed. "You'd grown up, changed, but you were still my little sister, still Martha." "Then why?" The question came out as a broken whisper. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me marry you? Why did you father a child with me?" Thomas was quiet for so long that Martha wondered if he would answer at all. When he finally spoke, his words carried a weight of anguish that might have moved her if she weren't so horrified by their situation. "Because I loved you," he said, "not as a brother should love a sister, but as a man loves a woman. I'd felt that way since we were children, and I'd hated myself for it. When Papa sent me away, I thought distance would cure me, but it only made the feeling stronger. When I saw you in Copper Ridge, beautiful and independent, and everything I'd dreamed you might become," he shrugged helplessly, "I told myself it was fate. I told myself that God had given us both new lives, new identities, a chance to be together, the way I'd always wanted." "What you wanted was evil," Martha said, her voice shaking with a mixture of rage and revulsion. "What we did was evil, our child." She couldn't finish the sentence. "Elizabeth is perfect," Thomas said fiercely. "She's beautiful and healthy and perfect, and nothing can change that." But Martha knew better. She had heard the whispered stories about what happened when blood relatives reproduced. The hidden children kept away from public view. The families torn apart by shame and genetic inheritance. The baby seemed healthy now, but what might manifest as she grew? What terrible legacy might they have passed on to their innocent daughter? The argument that followed was heated, but conducted in whispers. Both of them acutely aware that their cabin walls were thin, and their neighbors were always listening for anything resembling drama or scandal. By the end of the night they had reached an impasse. Thomas refused to acknowledge that their marriage was anything other than a blessing from Providence, while Martha insisted that they must confess their sin and face the consequences, whatever they might be. It was Martha who blinked first, exhausted by the emotional turmoil and still weak from childbirth. She agreed to Thomas's plea for time to consider their options. They would tell no one about their discovery for now. But Martha reserved the right to act on her conscience when she felt strong enough to face the community's reaction. She went to bed that night, believing she had bought herself time to plan. She had no way of knowing that Thomas had already begun making plans of his own, or that those plans would soon transform their personal crisis into a community-wide tragedy that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Within a week of that confrontation, the first accident occurred. The victim was Sarah Henley, a 43-year-old widow who had arrived in Copper Ridge the previous summer with her teenage son. Sarah had been one of the few women Martha considered a friend, someone with whom she could discuss books and share the burden of being an educated woman in a settlement where intellectual conversation was rare. More importantly for Thomas's purposes, Sarah had been present during several conversations where Martha had spoken about her family background, including details about her childhood in Chicago and her brother, who had supposedly died in the fire. The accident occurred on March 23rd, 8 days after Martha's confrontation with Thomas. Sarah had been returning from the Hendricks store when she apparently slipped on a patch of ice near the steep drop-off behind the assay office. Her body was found the next morning by miners heading to work, broken on the rocks 50 feet below the main settlement. The death seemed tragic, but unremarkable. Ice was a constant hazard in Copper Ridge, and several people had suffered serious injuries from falls during the winter months. Sarah was buried in the small cemetery above the settlement, mourned by the community, but quickly forgotten as frontier life demanded that the living focus on survival rather than grief. Martha attended the funeral, standing beside Thomas as the makeshift pastor read words over Sarah's grave. She noticed that her husband seemed unusually affected by the death, but attributed his emotional response to the general sentiment of loss that affected the entire community when one of their own died unexpectedly. It wasn't until 2 weeks later that Martha began to suspect that death hadn't been an accident. The realization came during a conversation with Sarah's son, 16-year-old David, who had been preparing to leave Copper Ridge and return to relatives in Kansas. David had been helping Martha organize Sarah's personal effects when he mentioned something that made Martha's blood run cold. "Mama was real excited the day before she died," David said, carefully folding his mother's dresses into a travel trunk. "She said she had something important to tell you, something she'd figured out that would make you happy. She was planning to come see you that very evening, but then she changed her mind and said it could wait until morning." "Did she say what it was?" Martha asked, though she was beginning to suspect the answer. "Something about your family," David replied. "She'd been thinking about stories you told her, and she said she'd put some pieces together that didn't add up, right? She was always good at puzzles, Mama was. She said it was like having extra pieces that didn't belong to the picture you thought you were making." Martha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Sarah had been intelligent and observant, exactly the kind of person who might notice inconsistencies in Thomas's story or spot resemblances that others missed. If she had indeed figured out the truth about Martha and Thomas's relationship, and if she had planned to share that information, the thought was too horrible to fully contemplate, but Martha found herself unable to dismiss it. She began to pay closer attention to the circumstances surrounding Sarah's death, asking casual questions of people who might have seen or heard something unusual that night. What she discovered only deepened her suspicions. Mrs. Patterson, who lived in the cabin nearest to the accident site, mentioned hearing voices near the drop-off around the time Sarah would have been returning from the store. Tom Bradley, who had been working late at the assay office, recalled seeing 2 figures walking together along the path where Sarah supposedly fell, though the distance and poor lighting had made it impossible to identify them. Most disturbing of all, Martha realized that Thomas had been absent from their cabin for nearly 2 hours that evening, claiming he needed to check on equipment at his claim site. She had been too preoccupied with caring for Elizabeth to pay much attention to his absence. But now, she remembered that he had returned home in an unusually agitated state, insisting on checking and rechecking the locks on their doors and windows. As April progressed, Martha found herself studying her husband with growing horror and fascination. If her suspicions were correct, if Thomas had indeed murdered Sarah to protect their secret, then she was living with a man capable of killing to preserve his deception. The thought should have driven her to flee, but where could she go? She was trapped by the isolation of their location, by her responsibility to Elizabeth, and by the terrifying realization that Thomas would never allow her to leave with knowledge that could destroy him. Instead, she began to watch and wait, looking for additional evidence while carefully maintaining the facade of their marriage. She paid closer attention to Thomas's movements, his conversations with other residents, his reactions to casual mentions of family or past experiences. What she observed only confirmed her worst fears. Thomas was not the gentle, considerate husband she had thought she married. Beneath his carefully maintained exterior, Martha glimpsed a man consumed by obsession and capable of ruthless calculation. He monitored her interactions with other residents, subtly discouraging friendships that might lead to revealing conversations. He had begun asking casual questions about what she remembered of their childhood, as if testing whether she had discovered additional evidence of their true relationship. Most chilling of all, Martha realized that Thomas was methodically identifying anyone who might pose a threat to their secret. He had begun engaging in seemingly innocent conversations with longtime residents, drawing out information about their memories and observations. She watched him catalog details about who had been where, on what dates, who might have overheard significant conversations, who possessed the intelligence and curiosity to piece together dangerous truths. The second accident occurred on April 14th. The victim was James Crawford, a miner who had worked claims near Thomas's site for the better part of a year. James had been present at several social gatherings where family histories were discussed, and Martha remembered him asking pointed questions about the supposed deaths of her parents and brother. He had seemed particularly interested in the details of the fire, noting inconsistencies in the official reports that Martha herself had never questioned. James was found dead at the bottom of his mine shaft, apparently the victim of a cave-in that had trapped him during a solo inspection of a potentially dangerous tunnel. The collapse appeared to have been triggered by structural instability, a common hazard in mining operations, where safety protocols were often ignored in favor of rapid extraction. But Martha noticed things that others missed or chose to overlook. James had been an experienced miner, cautious about safety procedures, and rarely worked alone in dangerous areas. The timing of his death, coming just days after he had approached Martha with questions about her family history, seemed too convenient to be coincidental, and when she discreetly examined the accident site, she found evidence that the cave-in might have been deliberately triggered. The signs were subtle. Scratches on support timbers that suggested tampering, tool marks that didn't match the equipment James typically used, a pattern of collapse that seemed more consistent with sabotage than natural structural failure. But Martha was no mining expert, and she couldn't be certain that her suspicions were based on evidence rather than paranoia. Still, she began to understand that she was witnessing something far more complex and sinister than a single murder, designed to protect a family's secret. Thomas wasn't simply eliminating immediate threats to their concealment. He was systematically removing anyone who might eventually pose a danger, creating a widening circle of death that encompassed anyone with the wrong combination of knowledge, curiosity, and intelligence. The pattern became clear as Martha reflected on the two deaths and considered the other residents who might be at risk. Both Sarah and James had been observant people who asked questions and remembered details. Both had shown interest in family histories and past events. Both had possessed the analytical skills to detect inconsistencies and draw uncomfortable conclusions. And both had died in accidents that eliminated them before they could share their suspicions with others. Martha realized that Thomas was implementing a long-term strategy designed to ensure their secret remained hidden indefinitely. He was willing to kill not just to protect their immediate situation, but to prevent any future threat from emerging. The scope of his planning, the cold calculation required to identify and eliminate multiple targets, revealed a capacity for evil that went far beyond the original sin of their unknowing, incestuous marriage. But understanding Thomas's strategy also allowed Martha to predict his next moves. She began to identify other residents who might be marked for elimination, people whose knowledge or curiosity made them potential threats in Thomas's paranoid assessment. What she discovered was that nearly a dozen members of the community possessed information or characteristics that could make them targets. The most obvious candidate was Dr. Edmund Fairchild, the settlement's unofficial physician, who had assisted with Elizabeth's birth and had made several comments about the baby's unusual features. Martha had dismissed his observations as the normal remarks of someone experienced with newborns, but she now realized that Fairchild might have noticed familial resemblances that could prove dangerous if he chose to investigate further. Also, at risk was Margaret Sullivan, an older woman who had lived in various mining settlements throughout Colorado and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of frontier genealogies. Margaret had a habit of discussing family connections and seemed to take particular interest in tracing the relationships between community members. Her knowledge of settlement patterns and family Movements could potentially expose inconsistencies in Thomas's fabricated history. Even more vulnerable was Pastor Reynolds, the circuit preacher who maintained records of marriages, births, and deaths throughout the territory. Reynolds had performed Martha and Thomas's wedding ceremony and had been present for Elizabeth's baptism. If he ever had reason to examine his records carefully, he might notice details that didn't align with the stories Thomas had told about his background. As Martha contemplated the growing list of potential victims, she faced an impossible choice. She could warn these people about the danger they faced, but doing so would require revealing the truth about her relationship with Thomas, a revelation that would destroy not only their lives, but also condemn their innocent daughter to a lifetime of shame and social ostracism. Alternatively, she could remain silent and watch as Thomas systematically murdered anyone who might threaten their secret. The decision was made for her on the night of April 28th, when she overheard Thomas talking to himself while he thought. She was asleep. The words she heard confirmed her worst fears and revealed the true scope of his murderous intentions. "Fairchild next," Thomas murmured, apparently reviewing a mental list of targets. Then Margaret, then the preacher. After that, maybe the Hyrax boy. He's too curious for his own good. Can't leave any loose ends. Can't risk exposure. Martha and Elizabeth depend on me to keep them safe. The twisted logic of his planning was clear. In Thomas's mind, he wasn't committing murder. He was protecting his family from discovery and the consequences that would follow. He had convinced himself that killing innocent people was not only justified, but necessary, a sacrifice required to preserve the life they had built together. Martha realized that she was witnessing the complete moral collapse of someone who had already crossed too many lines to ever find his way back to decency. Thomas was no longer the conflicted man who had struggled with forbidden feelings for his sister. He had become a calculating killer who viewed human life as an acceptable cost for maintaining his deception. But even as she recognized the monster her husband had become, Martha found herself paralyzed by the impossible nature of her situation. Any action she took to stop Thomas would inevitably expose their secret and destroy their daughter's future. Yet continuing to remain silent would make her complicit in the murders of innocent people who had done nothing wrong except possess knowledge or curiosity that Thomas deemed threatening. The weight of these considerations nearly drove Martha to despair. She spent days in a state of emotional paralysis, unable to eat or sleep properly, caring for Elizabeth through a haze of anxiety and moral anguish. She found herself studying her infant daughter's face, looking for signs of the genetic damage that might result from their incestuous union, terrified that she might see evidence of abnormality that would confirm her worst fears. It was during one of these dark vigils that Martha made the discovery that would ultimately provide the key to stopping Thomas's killing spree. While examining Elizabeth by candlelight, searching for any indication of developmental problems, she noticed something that should have been obvious from the moment of the baby's birth. Elizabeth was perfect, not just healthy, but unmistakably normal in every regard. Her features, her proportions, her responses, and development all fell well within the range of typical infant characteristics. There were no signs of the genetic abnormalities that typically resulted from close inbreeding. No indication that she had suffered any ill effects from her parents' shared bloodline. But, more significantly, as Martha studied the baby's face more carefully, she realized that Elizabeth didn't strongly resemble either her or Thomas. The infant's features seemed to represent a combination of characteristics that didn't align with what would be expected from siblings who shared both parents. Elizabeth's eye color, the shape of her ears, the particular curve of her lips. These details suggested genetic inheritance from sources beyond the Sinclair family line. The implications hit Martha like a physical blow. If Elizabeth didn't show strong familial resemblance to both parents, if she appeared to be the product of more diverse genetic inheritance, then perhaps the incestuous relationship wasn't as genetically close as Martha had feared. Perhaps Thomas wasn't actually her brother after all. This possibility opened up new questions that Martha had never thought to investigate. She had accepted the evidence of the photograph and Thomas's confession without considering alternative explanations. But what if the photograph had been mislabeled? What if Thomas had been adopted by the Sinclair family rather than born into it? What if their apparent resemblance was coincidental rather than genetic? For the first time since discovering the photograph, Martha felt a spark of hope. If she could prove that Thomas wasn't actually her brother, then their marriage would be unusual but not incestuous. Their daughter would be free from the stigma of genetic abnormality, and the moral crisis that had driven Thomas to murder would be resolved. But even as she entertained these hopeful possibilities, Martha realized that the truth about their relationship had become secondary to the larger problem of Thomas's murderous response to his belief in that relationship. Regardless of whether they were actually siblings, Thomas had already killed at least 2 people and was planning to kill more. The immediate crisis was no longer about genetic inheritance or moral transgression. It was about stopping a serial killer before he could claim additional victims. The realization galvanized Martha into action. Whatever the truth about their family connection, whatever the ultimate resolution of their personal crisis might be, she could not allow Thomas to continue murdering innocent people. The time for passive observation and moral paralysis had passed. She needed to find a way to expose Thomas's crimes and stop his killing spree, even if doing so meant destroying her own life in the process. But as Martha began to plan her next moves, she had no way of knowing that Thomas had already identified her as his next target, or that her own life was now in immediate danger from the man she had once loved as both husband and brother. Martha's investigation into Thomas's true identity began with the few personal possessions he had brought to their marriage. Working carefully during the hours when he was at the mines, she conducted systematic searches of their cabin, looking for additional documents or objects that might provide clues about his real background. What she found was more disturbing than helpful. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard, Thomas had concealed a collection of items that painted a picture of methodical deception spanning years. There were multiple identity papers bearing different names: Thomas Kellerman, Thomas Brennan, Thomas Crawford, each with carefully constructed histories that placed their origins in different states. There were letters written in Thomas's handwriting, but signed with various names, apparently part of correspondence designed to establish false backgrounds. Most chilling of all, there was a detailed notebook containing observations about the residents of Copper Ridge, including personal information that could only have been gathered through careful surveillance and deliberate investigation. The notebook revealed the true scope of Thomas's planning. He had been studying the settlement's residents since his arrival, cataloging their backgrounds, relationships, and potential vulnerabilities. Martha found detailed notes about Sarah Henley's family history, James Crawford's mining experience, and Dr. Fairchild's medical observations. But most disturbing were the entries about herself. Pages of careful documentation about her appearance, behavior, and family stories that suggested Thomas had been investigating her identity long before their supposed chance meeting. One particular entry dated just weeks after Martha's arrival in Copper Ridge made her blood run cold. "She doesn't recognize me yet, but the resemblance is unmistakable. The Sinclair girl, grown up and beautiful. This could be the opportunity I've been waiting for. Need to establish identity as Thomas Kellerman first, then begin careful approach. Must determine how much she remembers about family situation before making contact." The implications were clear. Thomas had recognized Martha immediately upon her arrival and had deliberately constructed the Thomas Kellerman identity specifically to court her. Their entire relationship had been built on premeditated deception, with Thomas manipulating circumstances to create the appearance of chance encounters and natural attraction. But even more disturbing were the recent entries, which revealed Thomas's growing paranoia about discovery and his systematic planning for eliminating potential threats. Martha found detailed surveillance notes about Sarah's movements in the days before her death, including observations about her interest in family histories and her plans to speak with Martha about her discoveries. There were similar notes about James Crawford's questions regarding the Chicago fire, along with technical observations about mine safety that had obviously been used to plan his murder. Most terrifying of all was the final entry dated just 3 days earlier. Martha knows her behavior has changed, and she's been asking subtle questions about the accidents. Need to determine extent of her knowledge and decide on appropriate response. May need to consider a permanent solution if she becomes threat to family security. Martha realized that Thomas had been monitoring her reactions and had correctly identified her growing suspicions. She was no longer just a conspirator in their deception. She had become a potential threat that Thomas was considering eliminating. The man she had married, the father of her child, was now evaluating whether she needed to die to preserve his secret. The discovery of the notebook forced Martha to confront the full scope of her situation. Thomas wasn't simply a man who had been driven to desperate acts by impossible circumstances. He was a methodical predator who had been planning and executing deceptions for years. The incestuous marriage wasn't an unfortunate consequence of frontier desperation. It was the calculated result of a deliberate campaign of manipulation and fraud. But the notebook also provided Martha with crucial information about Thomas's methods and mindset. She could see how he identified targets, how he planned their elimination, and how he justified his actions to himself. More importantly, she could use this knowledge to predict his next moves and possibly stay ahead of his murderous intentions. The immediate priority was establishing contact with potential victims before Thomas could eliminate them. Martha knew she couldn't warn everyone without revealing her own complicity in the deception, but she might be able to provide indirect warnings or encourage people to take precautions that would make them more difficult targets. She began with Dr. Fairchild, approaching him under the pretext of concerns about Elizabeth's development. During their conversation, Martha steered the discussion towards safety concerns in the settlement, noting the recent accidents and suggesting that everyone should be more careful about traveling alone or working in isolated areas. Fairchild proved to be more perceptive than Martha had expected. "I've been thinking the same thing," he said, his weathered face creased with concern. 2 deaths in 3 weeks, both involving people who were known for being careful and experienced, makes a man wonder if there might be more to these accidents than meets the eye. "What do you mean?" Martha asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "Well, I've been practicing medicine in mining settlements for nearly 20 years, Fairchild replied. "I've seen all kinds of accidents, and I've learned to recognize patterns that might not be obvious to others. These recent deaths, they don't quite fit the normal patterns I'd expect to see." Martha felt a surge of hope mixed with terror. Fairchild had clearly identified the same inconsistencies she had noticed, which meant he was capable of uncovering the truth about Thomas's crimes. But it also meant he was in immediate danger, exactly the kind of threat that Thomas would move quickly to eliminate. "Have you shared these concerns with anyone else?" Martha asked, trying to keep her voice casual, while her heart pounded with anxiety. "Not yet," Fairchild admitted. "I wanted to be more certain before making accusations, but I've been keeping careful notes about both incidents, and I'm planning to write to the territorial authorities in Denver. They have investigators who specialize in suspicious deaths in mining settlements." Martha felt the blood drain from her face. If Fairchild contacted the authorities, if trained investigators came to Copper Ridge, they would inevitably uncover not only Thomas's murders, but also the incestuous marriage that had motivated them. The entire web of deception would unravel, destroying not only her and Thomas, but also condemning Elizabeth to a lifetime of shame. "When are you planning to send this letter?" she asked. "Soon," Fairchild replied. "I want to examine the accident sites once more, make sure I have all the details correct, probably within the next few days." Martha realized she had perhaps 48 hours before Fairchild became an immediate threat that Thomas would feel compelled to eliminate. She needed to find a way to protect the doctor without exposing her own knowledge of Thomas's crimes, a seemingly impossible task that required delicate manipulation of a situation already balanced on a knife's edge. Her opportunity came sooner than expected. That evening, as she and Thomas sat by their fire while Elizabeth slept, Martha decided to test her husband's reactions by sharing carefully edited information about her conversation with Fairchild. "I spoke with Dr. Fairchild today about Elizabeth's development," she said, watching Thomas's face carefully. "He mentioned being concerned about the recent accidents. He thinks there might be something suspicious about Sarah's and James' deaths." Thomas's reaction was subtle but unmistakable. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and his hands stilled for just a moment before resuming their movement as he cleaned his mining equipment. "Did he say what made him suspicious?" "Medical training, I suppose," Martha replied. "He said the injuries didn't quite match what he'd expect from the types of accidents that supposedly occurred. He's thinking about writing to the territorial authorities." "That seems premature," Thomas said, his voice carefully neutral. "Accidents are common in mining settlements. I'm sure the territorial authorities have more important matters to investigate than every unfortunate mishap that occurs in remote locations." But Martha could see the calculation behind his calm exterior. Thomas was already planning Fairchild's elimination, considering methods and timing that would prevent the doctor from contacting outside authorities. She had perhaps one day to find a way to protect Fairchild without revealing her own knowledge of the threat. The solution came to her during a sleepless night spent listening to Thomas's breathing and wondering if she would live to see another dawn. She would use Thomas's own paranoia against him, providing him with information that would make Fairchild's elimination counterproductive rather than protective. The next morning, while Thomas prepared for another day at the mines, Martha shared a carefully constructed piece of intelligence designed to alter his calculations about the doctor. "I forgot to mention yesterday," she said, striving for a tone of casual afterthought. "Dr. Fairchild said he'd already written to his brother in Denver about the accidents. His brother is some kind of government official who handles investigations in the territory. Fairchild wanted professional advice about whether his concerns were justified." Thomas paused in his preparations, his back toward Martha so she couldn't see his expression. "He's already written." "Apparently," so Martha confirmed. "He said his brother would probably send investigators regardless of whether Fairchild writes again. Something about federal responsibility for mining settlement safety. It was a complete fabrication, but Martha hoped it would convince Thomas that killing Fairchild would only draw attention rather than prevent it. If investigators were already coming, eliminating the doctor would serve no protective purpose and might actually increase suspicion about the circumstances surrounding his death. Thomas finished his preparations in silence, but Martha could sense the frustration and recalculation taking place behind his composed facade. When he finally spoke, his words confirmed that her strategy had been at least partially successful. "If government investigators are coming to examine the accidents, we should probably consider leaving Copper Ridge," he said. "There's nothing keeping us here, and Elizabeth would be better off in a larger settlement with proper medical care and educational opportunities." Martha felt a surge of hope. If she could convince Thomas to leave voluntarily, she might be able to end his killing spree without exposing their secret or destroying their daughter's future. Once they were away from Copper Ridge, once the immediate pressures and threats were removed, perhaps Thomas could be convinced to abandon his murderous course and return to some semblance of normal behavior. "Where would we go?" she asked, trying to sound supportive rather than desperate. "Cal, maybe," Thomas replied. "Or Oregon, somewhere far enough away that we could start completely fresh, where no one knows our history or has reason to ask questions about our past." But even as Martha entertained hopes of escape, she realized that leaving Copper Ridge wouldn't solve the fundamental problem of Thomas's willingness to kill to protect their secret. He had already demonstrated that he could identify threats and eliminate them with ruthless efficiency. What would prevent him from continuing that pattern in their new location if he perceived new dangers to their concealment? More troubling still was the question of what Thomas might do to ensure their safe departure from Copper Ridge. Would he be content to simply leave potential threats behind, or would he feel compelled to eliminate anyone who might eventually cause problems for them? Martha began to envision a scenario in which Thomas systematically murdered everyone who possessed dangerous knowledge before their departure, leaving behind a settlement full of corpses and ensuring that their secrets died with their victims. Her fears proved to be well-founded. Over the following days, as Thomas made preparations for their departure, Martha noticed him paying unusual attention to the movements and activities of specific community members. He engaged in casual conversations with Margaret Sullivan about her knowledge of territorial families, with Pastor Reynolds about his record-keeping practices, and with various other residents who might pose future threats to their concealment. Most disturbing of all, Thomas began making subtle inquiries about the community's communication with the outside world. He asked about mail schedules, about planned visits from territorial officials, about any other residents who might have family or business connections in Denver or other major settlements. Martha realized he was identifying everyone who might be able to spread information about Copper Ridge's residents beyond the immediate community. The scope of Thomas's final preparations became clear when Martha discovered additional entries in his hidden notebook. Her husband was planning what could only be described as a massacre, the systematic elimination of more than a dozen community members before their departure. The list included not only obvious threats like Fairchild and Margaret Sullivan, but also seemingly innocent residents whose only crime was possessing information that might eventually prove inconvenient. Among the planned victims were the Hyrax family, who operated the general store and maintained correspondence with suppliers throughout the territory. Thomas had apparently decided that their business connections made them too dangerous to leave alive. Also marked for elimination were several miners who had worked closely with the deceased James Crawford and might eventually remember conversations about family histories or mining accidents. Most horrifying of all was Thomas's plan for ensuring that their departure from Copper Ridge would never be traced or investigated. He intended to stage a catastrophic mining accident that would destroy much of the settlement and kill most of its residents, making it appear that he and Martha had perished along with everyone else. Only a few carefully selected survivors would remain, people who possessed no dangerous knowledge and who could be trusted to report the official version of events to territorial authorities. Martha realized that she was witnessing the planning of one of the most elaborate mass murders in frontier history, a crime so ambitious and ruthless that it defied comprehension. Thomas wasn't simply protecting their secret anymore. He was attempting to erase an entire community to ensure that their deception could never be exposed. The discovery of Thomas's final plan forced Martha to confront the ultimate moral choice she had been avoiding. She could no longer pretend that passive resistance or subtle manipulation would be sufficient to prevent catastrophe. If she wanted to save the lives of innocent people, she would have to take direct action against her husband, even if doing so meant exposing their secret and destroying their daughter's future. But as Martha steeled herself for the confrontation she knew must come, she made one final discovery that changed everything she thought she knew about their situation. Hidden among Thomas's possessions, she found a document that revealed the ultimate truth about their relationship, a truth so shocking that it decontextualized everything that had happened and provided the key to stopping Thomas's murderous campaign without destroying their own lives. The document was a birth certificate, yellowed with age, and bearing the official seal of Cook County, Illinois. It identified Thomas not as Thomas Sinclair, but as Thomas Brennan. Born to Patrick and Mary Brennan on the same date Martha remembered as her brother's birthday, The certificate listed no connection to the Sinclair family whatsoever. Attached to the birth certificate was a letter written in a careful feminine hand that Martha recognized as belonging to her mother. The letter, addressed to someone named Father Mackenzie, explained the circumstances that had led to Thomas's presence in the Sinclair household. The boy's parents died in the cholera outbreak of 1851, and he was taken in by St. Mary's Orphanage. We agreed to provide him with a home and family, though we were not permitted to adopt him formally due to his background. Thomas has lived with us for 3 years now, and has become like a son to us. But we understand that he must eventually be placed with a Catholic family that can provide proper religious instruction. Until such placement can be arranged, we are happy to care for him as our own. The implications of this discovery hit Martha like a thunderbolt. Thomas wasn't her brother. He wasn't even related to the Sinclair family. He had been a foster child, taken in temporarily by her parents, but never formally adopted. The photograph she had found, the one that had started this entire nightmare, had been mislabeled or misinterpreted. The family resemblance, she thought, she had detected, was either coincidental or the product of wishful thinking. Their marriage wasn't incestuous. Their daughter wasn't the product of genetic abnormality. The entire moral crisis that had driven Thomas to murder was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of their true relationship. But even as Martha felt a surge of relief about the resolution of their genetic concerns, she realized that this discovery created a new and equally terrifying problem. If Thomas wasn't actually her brother, then his recognition of her in Copper Ridge had been fraudulent from the beginning. He had deliberately deceived her about their supposed family connection, manipulating her emotions and constructing an elaborate fiction to justify their relationship. More disturbing still was the question of Thomas's true identity and background. If he wasn't Thomas Sinclair, if he had been using false names and constructed histories for years, then who was he really? What had driven him to seek out Martha specifically? And what did his willingness to commit multiple murders to protect a fictional relationship reveal about his true character and motivations? As Martha studied the documents more carefully, she began to piece together a picture of Thomas's real history that was far more sinister than anything she had previously imagined. The multiple identity papers, the careful surveillance of her activities, the methodical planning of their relationship, all of these suggested not a desperate man driven to extremes by impossible circumstances, but a calculating predator who had been stalking her for reasons she couldn't yet comprehend. The truth about Thomas's identity would prove to be the key to stopping his murderous campaign. But it would also reveal a conspiracy far more complex and terrifying than anything Martha had imagined possible in their remote mountain settlement. The revelation about Thomas's true identity sent Martha into a state of shock so profound that she could barely function for the remainder of that day. Every interaction with her husband, every casual word or gesture, now carried the weight of deception so elaborate that it challenged her understanding of reality itself. The man she had loved, married, and borne a child with was not only a murderer, but a complete stranger who had constructed their entire relationship on foundations of fraud and manipulation. As she struggled to process this information while maintaining the appearance of normalcy, Martha began to notice details about Thomas's behavior that she had previously overlooked or misinterpreted. His knowledge of her childhood, which she had attributed to their supposed shared experiences, was actually too specific and detailed for someone who had lived with her family for only 3 years as a young child. He knew things about her parents' habits, about family traditions, about intimate details of Sinclair family life that an orphaned foster child would never have learned. More troubling still were Thomas's reactions to certain topics of conversation. Whenever Martha mentioned specific events from her childhood, particularly those that had occurred after Thomas would have left their household, he displayed knowledge that he shouldn't have possessed. He knew about her father's business struggles in the years before the fire, about her mother's illness, about family decisions and conversations that had taken place long after he would have been placed elsewhere. The implications were chilling. Thomas hadn't simply recognized her by chance in Copper Ridge. He had been watching her, studying her, possibly for years, before their supposed accidental meeting. The depth of his knowledge about her life suggested surveillance that extended far beyond casual observation, involving deliberate investigation and possibly even contact with people who had known the Sinclair family. But perhaps most disturbing of all was Martha's growing realization that she had never actually verified Thomas's death in the Chicago fire. She had been told by authorities that he had perished, but she had never seen a body or examined any physical evidence of his death. In the chaos and grief following the loss of her parents, she had simply accepted the official reports without question. What if the real Thomas Sinclair had indeed died in that fire, and this man had simply assumed his identity as part of an elaborate deception? What if he had been watching Martha for years, learning everything he could about her family history, waiting for the right opportunity to approach her under circumstances that would make his recognition seem natural and his interest appear legitimate? The possibility that her husband might be wearing the identity of her dead brother like a disguise was so horrifying that Martha could barely bring herself to consider it fully, but the evidence seemed to point inexorably toward that conclusion, explaining both the depth of his knowledge about her family and the calculated nature of their relationship. As Martha grappled with these revelations, she became aware that Thomas was accelerating his preparations for the settlement's destruction. His casual conversations with community members had become more pointed and urgent, as if he were gathering final pieces of information needed to complete his murderous plan. He had begun making excuses to visit various locations throughout Copper Ridge, apparently conducting reconnaissance that would help him coordinate the complex logistics of mass murder. Most ominously, Thomas had started acquiring materials that could be used to create the catastrophic mining accident he planned to stage. Martha watched him accumulate dynamite, blasting powder, and other explosives under the pretext of expanding his mining operations. He claimed to be planning an ambitious excavation that would require significant amounts of explosive material. But Martha knew the true purpose of his preparations. The timeline for Thomas's attack was becoming clear. He planned to implement his scheme within days before Dr. Fairchild's supposed letter to territorial authorities could bring investigators to Copper Ridge. Martha realized she had perhaps 72 hours to find a way to stop a massacre that would claim the lives of virtually everyone she knew. But stopping Thomas would require more than simply warning the community about his intentions. His plan was too elaborate, too well prepared to be thwarted by simple precautions or increased vigilance. The explosives he had gathered could cause devastation, regardless of whether people were specifically targeted, and his knowledge of the settlement's layout and routines would allow him to maximize casualties, even if residents were alerted to the danger. More fundamentally, Martha realized that exposing Thomas's murder plot would inevitably lead to questions about his identity and motivations, potentially revealing their false marriage and destroying Elizabeth's future. Even if she could save the community, doing so might condemn her daughter to a lifetime of shame and social ostracism as the child of an elaborate fraud. The moral calculus was agonizing. Martha found herself weighing the lives of dozens of innocent people against the future of her infant daughter, trying to find some course of action that could preserve both without requiring impossible sacrifices. The weight of these considerations nearly drove her to despair. But it also forced her to confront the fundamental question that had haunted her since discovering Thomas's true nature. What kind of person had she become by remaining silent about his crimes for so long? Her internal struggle was interrupted by a discovery that changed the entire dynamic of their situation. While Thomas was away making his final preparations, Martha conducted one last search of their cabin, looking for any additional information that might help her understand his true identity or find a way to stop his plan. Hidden beneath their bed, wrapped in oilcloth and concealed behind a loose board, she found a collection of documents that revealed the full scope of Thomas's deception and provided the key to understanding his true motivations. The papers included correspondence with various individuals throughout the Colorado Territory, all written under different assumed names, and all related to a systematic campaign of fraud and theft that had been ongoing for years. Thomas, whatever his real name might be, wasn't simply a disturbed individual driven to murder by psychological obsession. He was a professional criminal who specialized in elaborate confidence schemes designed to defraud mining settlements and frontier communities. The documents revealed that he had operated similar deceptions in at least 6 other locations, always targeting isolated communities, where careful background checks were impossible, and where residents were likely to have accumulated significant amounts of gold or cash. His method was consistent and sophisticated. He would arrive in a settlement under an assumed identity, establish himself as a reliable community member, then identify the most vulnerable and profitable targets for exploitation. In some cases, he had courted and married wealthy widows before, disappearing with their assets. In others, he had established business partnerships that allowed him to embezzle funds or steal valuable mining claims. But the Copper Ridge operation was different from his previous schemes, in both scope and ambition. Rather than simply stealing from individual victims, Thomas was planning to loot the entire settlement, taking advantage of the community's accumulated wealth before destroying all evidence of his presence. The mass murder wasn't motivated by psychological compulsion. It was a calculated business decision designed to eliminate witnesses and ensure that his crimes could never be investigated. The documents also revealed why Thomas had specifically targeted Martha. She wasn't a random victim who happened to resemble his supposed sister. She was a carefully selected mark whose tragic background made her particularly susceptible to emotional manipulation. Thomas had researched the Sinclair family tragedy specifically because it provided him with the perfect cover story for approaching Martha with a romantic interest that seemed based on destiny rather than calculation. Even more chilling was the evidence that Thomas had been planning the Copper Ridge operation for over 2 years before implementing it. He had studied the settlement's economic patterns, identified its most profitable residents, and carefully constructed the Thomas Kellerman identity to maximize his acceptance within the community. His marriage to Martha wasn't a crime of passion or psychological compulsion. It was a long-term investment in establishing credibility and access to information about community resources. But perhaps most horrifying of all was Martha's realization that Thomas's ultimate plan extended beyond simple theft and murder. The documents revealed that he intended to take Elizabeth with him when he fled Copper Ridge, raising her as his own daughter while using their supposed family relationship to establish credibility in whatever community he targeted next. Martha wasn't just married to a serial killer, she was the unwitting mother of his intended accomplice, a child who would be raised to participate in future schemes of fraud and murder. The discovery of Thomas's true nature and intentions galvanized Martha into action. Whatever the personal cost, whatever the consequences for her own future, she could not allow this monster to destroy her community, steal their accumulated wealth, and kidnap her daughter for use in future crimes. The time for passive resistance and moral agonizing had passed. She needed to find a way to stop Thomas immediately before he could implement the final phase of his murderous plan. But as Martha began to formulate a strategy for exposing Thomas's crimes and preventing the massacre, she made one final discovery that revealed just how immediate and personal the danger had become. Among the most recent documents was a detailed timeline for the attack, complete with specific targets and methods for each phase of the operation. According to Thomas's plan, the destruction of Copper Ridge would begin the following evening with the systematic elimination of key community members, starting with Dr. Fairchild and continuing through a carefully prioritized list of residents who posed the greatest threats to his escape. But the first name on that list scheduled for elimination, even before the doctor, was Martha herself. Thomas had concluded that his wife knew too much about his activities to be allowed to survive, Her behavior over the past weeks had convinced him that she represented an unacceptable risk to the success of his operation. According to his notes, Martha would die in an apparent accident that very night, leaving Elizabeth orphaned and completely dependent on her supposed father's care. Martha realized that she had perhaps 6 hours to save not only her community, but also her own life. Thomas would return from his preparations, expecting to find her unaware and vulnerable, ready to become the first victim of his final murderous campaign. Instead, he would find a woman who had finally discovered the full truth about his identity and intentions. Someone who was prepared to fight back against the monster she had unknowingly married. The confrontation that followed would determine not only whether Martha and Elizabeth survived, but whether the residents of Copper Ridge would live to see another dawn. And as Martha prepared for what might be the final hours of her life, she couldn't know that the truth about Thomas's identity would prove to be even more shocking than anything she had already discovered, or that the real story behind their relationship would reveal connections to her past that went back much further than either of them had imagined. Martha spent the remaining hours before Thomas's return preparing for a confrontation that would determine the fate of everyone in Copper Ridge. Using the intelligence she had gathered from his hidden documents, she began to understand the full scope of his plan and identify potential weaknesses that might be exploited to stop him. Thomas' scheme depended heavily on timing and coordination. He needed to eliminate key witnesses before they could raise alarms, secure the settlement's accumulated wealth before it could be hidden or protected, and stage the catastrophic explosion that would destroy evidence of his crimes while making his escape appear to be death in a tragic accident. Any disruption of this carefully orchestrated timeline could potentially unravel the entire operation. Martha's best opportunity lay in preventing Thomas from completing the initial phase of targeted murders. If she could warn Dr. Fairchild and other priority targets, if she could disrupt his ability to move freely through the settlement, she might be able to force him into a reactive position, where his elaborate plan would become impossible to execute. But implementing this strategy required Martha to overcome her fear of exposure and public humiliation. Stopping Thomas would inevitably mean revealing at least some aspects of their deceptive relationship, potentially destroying her reputation and Elizabeth's future prospects. The choice between protecting her community and protecting her daughter had become unavoidable. As evening approached, Martha made her final preparations. She gathered the most damning evidence of Thomas's crimes, including documents that revealed his true identity and detailed his murder plans. She wrote a letter explaining the situation to Dr. Fairchild, providing enough information to convince him of the immediate danger without revealing the full extent of her own complicity. Most importantly, she secured Elizabeth in the safest location she could arrange, the church basement, where the stone construction might provide protection if Thomas succeeded in detonating his explosives. Thomas returned to their cabin just after sunset, appearing calm and relaxed despite the magnitude of what he planned to accomplish that night. He embraced Martha with what seemed like genuine affection, kissed their daughter's forehead with apparent tenderness, and settled into their evening routine as if nothing unusual was planned. "How was your day?" Martha asked, struggling to keep her voice steady while watching the man she now knew to be a professional killer. "Productive," Thomas replied, beginning to clean his mining equipment with the same methodical care he applied to all his activities. "I've finished the preparations for tomorrow's excavation. Should be quite a spectacle when those charges go off." The casual reference to explosives that would kill dozens of people sent a chill through Martha's body. Thomas's ability to discuss MASS murder with such offhand normally revealed the depth of his psychological detachment from the humanity of his victims. To him, the residents of Copper Ridge weren't people with lives and families and dreams. They were simply obstacles to be removed and resources to be exploited. "Will it be dangerous?" Martha asked, testing his reactions while gathering final intelligence about his timeline. All mining operations involve some risk, Thomas said, not looking up from his equipment. But I've taken proper precautions. The charges are carefully calculated to achieve maximum effect while minimizing unpredictable consequences. Martha realized that Thomas was speaking in a kind of code, describing his murder plan in language that would seem innocent to anyone who didn't understand the true context. His reference to maximum effect meant maximum casualties, while minimizing unpredictable consequences meant ensuring that no witnesses survived to testify about what they had seen. As they continued their conversation, Martha became aware that Thomas was studying her reactions more carefully than usual. He asked seemingly innocent questions about her day, about people she had spoken with, about any unusual conversations or observations she might have had. She realized he was conducting a final assessment of whether she posed an immediate threat to his operation. "You seem distracted tonight," Thomas observed, his tone casual, but his eyes alert. "Is everything all right?" "Just tired," Martha replied, hoping her nervousness would be attributed to normal maternal exhaustion rather than knowledge of his murderous intentions. "Elizabeth was fussy today, and I haven't been sleeping well lately." "Perhaps you should rest early tonight," Thomas suggested. "I need to check on some equipment before tomorrow's work, so I'll be out for a few hours. You could sleep while I'm gone." Martha felt her blood run cold. Thomas was providing himself with an alibi while giving her an opportunity to be alone and vulnerable. If she followed his suggestion, she would be asleep and defenseless when he returned to murder her. The casual way he offered this advice, as if he were genuinely concerned for her welfare, demonstrated the depths of his deception and the calculating nature of his evil. "That sounds like a good idea," Martha said, forcing herself to smile while her heart pounded with terror. "I'll put Elizabeth down and rest for a while." Thomas nodded approvingly and gathered his outdoor gear, preparing for what Martha knew would be a night of systematic murder, beginning with her own death. As he moved about their cabin, she watched him with new eyes, seeing past the familiar facade to the predator beneath. Every gesture, every casual comment, every display of apparent affection was revealed as part of an elaborate performance designed to maintain her trust until the moment when it was no longer necessary. "I'll be back before midnight," Thomas said, kissing Martha's forehead with lips that would soon be stained with the blood of innocent people. "Sleep well." After Thomas left, Martha waited exactly 10 minutes to ensure he was truly gone before implementing her desperate plan to save Copper Ridge. She gathered Elizabeth and the evidence she had compiled, then made her way through the darkened settlement toward Dr. Fairchild's cabin, moving carefully to avoid being seen by Thomas or his potential accomplices. But as she crept through the shadows between buildings, Martha heard sounds that made her realize she might already be too late. From the direction of Fairchild's cabin came the unmistakable sounds of struggle, a brief muffled cry, followed by the heavy thud of something falling to the floor. Martha pressed herself against the wall of the nearest building, clutching Elizabeth tightly while her mind raced through the implications of what she had heard. If Thomas had already reached Fairchild, if the doctor was already dead, then the first phase of his murder plan was already underway. The systematic elimination of Copper Ridge's residents had begun, and Martha might be the only person left. Who could stop the massacre? Moving with desperate caution, she approached Fairchild's cabin and peered through a window that provided a view of the main room. What she saw confirmed her worst fears and revealed the true scope of the horror that was about to engulf their community. Dr. Fairchild lay motionless on the floor, blood pooling beneath his head from a wound that was clearly fatal. But Thomas wasn't alone in the cabin. 3 other men moved through the space with practiced efficiency, searching for documents and valuables, while their leader examined Fairchild's medical bag and personal papers. Martha recognized 2 of the men as recent arrivals to Copper Ridge, miners who had claimed to be seeking work, but who had actually been surveying the settlement's defenses and resources. The 3rd man was a stranger, but his calm demeanor and Obvious familiarity with Thomas suggested that he was part of the same criminal organization. The realization hit Martha like a physical blow. Thomas wasn't working alone. He was part of a larger group of professional criminals who specialized in the systematic looting and destruction of frontier settlements. The Copper Ridge operation wasn't an isolated crime committed by a single disturbed individual, but rather the latest in a series of coordinated attacks that had probably claimed hundreds of lives across the Colorado Territory. But even as Martha struggled to process this revelation, she became aware of movement behind her. A hand clamped over her mouth, preventing her from crying out, while strong arms lifted her bodily from the ground. She found herself face to face with another member of Thomas's gang, a man whose scarred features and cold eyes left no doubt about his capacity for violence. "Well, well," the man said, his voice carrying a faint accent that Martha couldn't identify. "Look what we have here." The little wife out for a midnight stroll with the baby. Martha tried to struggle, but the man's grip was too strong, and her fear for Elizabeth's safety paralyzed her with terror. She could only watch helplessly as he carried her toward Fairchild's cabin, where Thomas and his confederates were completing their grisly work. Thomas looked up as they entered, his expression showing no surprise at Martha's capture. "I was wondering when you'd make your move," he said, his tone conversational despite the circumstances. "You've been watching me for days, haven't you? Trying to figure out what I was planning." "Let us go," Martha whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please, Thomas, whatever you're going to do, Elizabeth is innocent. She doesn't deserve to suffer for your crimes." "Thomas," the scarred man laughed, a sound devoid of warmth or humor. "You still think his name is Thomas? Lady, you don't know? The first thing about your husband." Martha looked between the two men, confusion adding another layer to her terror. "What do you mean?" "Tell her, Marcus," the scarred man said to the man Martha had known as Thomas. "Tell her who you really are. She's going to die anyway. Might as well let her know the truth." The man Martha had married, the father of her child, studied her with eyes that now seemed completely alien. "My name is Marcus Brennan," he said finally. "I'm originally from Boston, though I've lived under more identities than I can easily remember. I've been specializing in frontier settlement operations for about 8 years now. But the documents I found," Martha said desperately, "the birth certificate, the letter from my mother, all forgeries," Marcus replied. "Very good ones, I'll admit. I have a talented associate in Denver who creates whatever paperwork I need for my operations. The Sinclair family tragedy was a matter of public record. It wasn't difficult to research the details and create a convincing backstory." The casual way he discussed the fabrication of their entire relationship, the easy admission that everything she had believed about their love was nothing more than an elaborate fraud, struck Martha like a physical blow. She had known intellectually that Marcus was a criminal and a killer, but hearing him dismiss their marriage as just another business transaction drove home the full extent of his monstrosity. "Why?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "Why me? Why did you choose me specifically?" "You were perfect for our purposes," Marcus explained as if discussing a business investment. "A woman alone with enough education to be respected in the community, but isolated enough to be vulnerable to romantic manipulation. Your tragic background made you sympathetic to others while providing me with a ready-made cover story for my own supposed past. Marrying you gave me instant credibility and access to community information that would have taken months to acquire otherwise. And Elizabeth?" Martha's voice broke as she asked the question. "A useful addition to my cover," Marcus replied without emotion. "A family man is always trusted more than a bachelor, especially in settlements where community stability is valued. Elizabeth will continue to serve that purpose in our next operation." The cold calculation behind his words, the casual way he discussed using their daughter as a prop in future crimes, finally broke through Martha's paralysis and filled her with a rage that overcame her fear. This monster had stolen her life, perverted her love, and now planned to corrupt her innocent child for his own evil purposes. "You won't touch her?" Martha said, her voice gaining strength despite her desperate circumstances. "I won't let you turn Elizabeth into an accomplice to your crimes." Marcus smiled, the first genuine expression she had seen from him all evening. "You won't be in a position to stop me," he said. "But don't worry, Elizabeth will be well cared for. Children are very adaptable, and she'll learn to see me as her loving father who's providing her with exciting adventures." The image of Elizabeth growing up to become a criminal, corrupted by the man who had murdered her mother and destroyed her community, was more than Martha could bear. In that moment, her fear transformed into determination. Whatever the cost, whatever the consequences, she would find a way to protect her daughter and stop these monsters from claiming more victims. But as Martha prepared to make a desperate move against her captors, the sound of approaching footsteps from outside the cabin revealed that the situation was about to become even more complex and dangerous. Someone else was coming, either another victim walking unknowingly into Marcus' trap, or a potential ally who might help her turn the tide against the killers. The identity of the approaching figure would determine whether Martha's defiance would be her final act of courage, or the beginning of a fight that might still save Copper Ridge from destruction. The footsteps outside Dr. Fairchild's cabin belonged to Sheriff Henry Patterson, the territorial lawman who had arrived in Copper Ridge that very evening on what Martha would later learn was an unrelated investigation. Patterson had been tracking reports of fraudulent mining claims throughout the Colorado Territory, following a pattern of crimes that had led him directly to Marcus Brennan and his Confederates. Patterson's arrival was perfectly timed, but entirely coincidental. He had stopped at Fairchild's cabin, seeking medical attention for his horse, which had gone lame during the difficult mountain journey. The light in the doctor's window had suggested that Fairchild was awake and available, leading Patterson to approach the cabin at the exact moment when Marcus was explaining his criminal methodology to Martha. The sheriff's trained ear immediately recognized the sounds of multiple voices and movement patterns that didn't match a normal medical consultation. Rather than announce his presence, Patterson carefully positioned himself where he could observe the situation through the cabin's window, quickly assessing the scene and recognizing it as a crime in progress. What Patterson saw confirmed his worst suspicions about the criminal organization he had been tracking. The dead body of Dr. Fairchild, the obvious leader discussing the systematic looting of frontier settlements, and the terrified woman holding an infant, all painted a clear picture of the conspiracy he had been investigating for months. Patterson was an experienced lawman who had dealt with frontier violence throughout his career, but he had never encountered criminals of Marcus Brennan's sophistication and ruthlessness. The sheriff realized that he was facing not just a murder in progress, but a conspiracy that threatened the lives of everyone in Copper Ridge. Moving with careful precision, Patterson retreated far enough from the cabin to avoid detection while he formulated a strategy for intervention. He was outnumbered and operating in unfamiliar territory, but he possessed two crucial advantages: the element of surprise and detailed knowledge of Marcus Brennan's criminal methods from his previous investigations. Patterson had been tracking the Brennan organization for over a year, following a trail of destroyed settlements and murdered families across 3 territories. He knew that Marcus specialized in elaborate deceptions designed to gain community trust before implementing systematic looting operations. The sheriff also knew that Brennan's crimes typically culminated in spectacular acts of violence designed to eliminate witnesses and destroy evidence. What Patterson didn't know was that Marcus had already positioned explosives throughout Copper Ridge, ready to detonate in a coordinated sequence that would destroy most of the settlement within minutes. The sheriff's intervention had to account not only for the immediate threat to the hostages in Fairchild's cabin, but also for the larger conspiracy that threatened the entire community. Inside the cabin, Marcus was growing impatient with the delay caused by Patterson's approach. He had a careful timeline to maintain with specific targets to eliminate before dawn. The presence of an unknown visitor threatened to disrupt his entire operation. "Check outside." Marcus ordered one of his confederates. "Find out who's out there and deal with them quickly. We can't afford any more complications tonight." The scarred man who had captured Martha moved toward the cabin door, drawing a pistol as he prepared to investigate the disturbance. But as he reached for the door handle, Patterson struck with the precision and timing that had made him one of the most effective lawmen in the Colorado Territory. The sheriff's first shot shattered the cabin window and struck the scarred man in the shoulder, spinning him away from the door and creating the distraction Patterson needed to burst into the room. His second shot was aimed at Marcus, but the criminal leader had already moved behind Martha, using her and Elizabeth as human shields while drawing his own weapon. "Drop your gun, Sheriff," Marcus said, his voice calm despite the chaos erupting around him, "unless you want to explain to this baby's grandparents how your heroics got her killed." Patterson found himself in the nightmare scenario that every lawman dreaded. A standoff where innocent lives hung in the balance and any action could result in tragedy. But his experience with Marcus Brennan's organization had taught him that negotiation was futile. These criminals would kill their hostages regardless of whether Patterson surrendered, and delaying action would only give them more opportunities to escape or implement their larger plan. "I know who you are, Brennan," Patterson said, keeping his weapon trained on the criminal, despite the impossible shot angle. "I've been tracking your organization across 3 territories. I know about the settlements you've destroyed, the families you've murdered. This ends tonight, does it?" Marcus replied, pressing his pistol against Martha's temple. "Because from where I stand, it looks like you're the one who's trapped. My associates have charges planted throughout this settlement. One word from me, and this entire mountain will come down on everyone's head." The threat wasn't idle bluster. Patterson could see the confidence in Marcus's eyes, the assurance of someone who held multiple advantages in a complex game of life and death. The sheriff realized that stopping the immediate threat in the cabin would be meaningless if Marcus' confederates succeeded in detonating the explosives that would kill hundreds of innocent people. But Martha, who had been listening to this exchange while calculating her own desperate options, suddenly spoke up with information that changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. "The explosives are in his cabin," she said, her voice steady, despite the gun pressed against her head. "Under our bed, wrapped in oilcloth. He's been storing them there for weeks." Marcus's expression flickered with surprise and anger. He hadn't expected Martha to possess specific knowledge about his preparations, and her revelation had just provided Patterson with crucial intelligence about the location of the primary threat. "You've been busy, haven't you, dear wife?" Marcus said, his tone carrying new menace. "I underestimated your curiosity. That was a mistake I won't make again." But Marcus's acknowledgement of Martha's intelligence-gathering efforts also revealed something important to Patterson. The woman he was trying to save wasn't an innocent victim who had stumbled into a criminal conspiracy. She was someone who had been actively investigating her husband's activities and might possess additional information crucial to stopping the larger plot. "What else do you know?" Patterson asked Martha, keeping his gun trained on Marcus while trying to extract information that might save the settlement. "He has Confederates positioned throughout Copper Ridge," Martha replied, ignoring Marcus' increased pressure on the gun against her temple. "They arrived over the past month, claiming to be miners looking for work. There are at least 6 of them, maybe more. They've been surveying the settlement, identifying targets, preparing for coordinated attacks." This intelligence confirmed Patterson's worst fears about the scope of the conspiracy. Marcus wasn't operating with just the 3 men in the cabin. He had positioned a small army throughout Copper Ridge, ready to implement a plan that would make the settlement's destruction appear to be a tragic mining accident rather than a coordinated massacre. "The charges are set to detonate at midnight," Martha continued, her voice gaining strength as she realized that sharing information might be their only hope of survival. He planned to eliminate key witnesses first, then trigger the explosions. That would destroy evidence and kill anyone who might survive to tell the truth. Patterson glanced at his pocket watch and felt his blood run cold. It was already past 11 o'clock. Giving them less than an hour to locate and disarm explosives scattered throughout a settlement they barely knew. Even if he could neutralize Marcus and his immediate Confederates, stopping the larger conspiracy would require coordination and manpower that simply wasn't available. But as Patterson considered their impossible situation, Martha made a decision that demonstrated the courage and determination that had carried her through months of living with a monster without losing her humanity or her love for her daughter. With a sudden twist that caught Marcus off guard, Martha threw herself sideways while simultaneously lifting Elizabeth above her head, creating a clear shot for Patterson while protecting her daughter from the inevitable gunfire. The move was desperate and dangerous, requiring split-second timing and absolute trust in the sheriff's marksmanship. Patterson didn't hesitate. His shot took Marcus in the chest, spinning the criminal leader away from Martha and sending his pistol clattering across the cabin floor. The sheriff's second shot struck one of the remaining Confederates who was attempting to draw his own weapon, while the third man raised his hands in surrender as he found himself facing an angry lawman with a smoking gun. But even as Patterson secured the immediate scene, both he and Martha knew that their victory was incomplete. Somewhere in Copper Ridge, Marcus' remaining Confederates were continuing to implement their murderous plan, unaware that their leader had been captured. The explosives were still in position, the timeline was still advancing, and innocent people were still in mortal danger. "We need to warn the settlement," Martha said, clutching Elizabeth while checking to ensure her daughter hadn't been injured. "In the struggle, everyone needs to evacuate before midnight." "There isn't enough time," Patterson replied grimly. "It would take hours to wake everyone, explain the situation, and organize an evacuation. And Marcus' Confederates would see the activity and probably detonate early rather than risk exposure." Martha felt despair wash over her as she realized that despite their success in stopping Marcus, they might still fail to save the community. That had become her home. But as she looked down at Elizabeth, seeing her daughter's innocent face illuminated by the flickering candlelight, she found the strength to continue fighting for their survival. "Then we stop the Confederates ourselves," she said, her voice carrying a determination that surprised even Patterson. "I know where they're positioned. I know their routines. We can stop them if we move quickly and carefully." Patterson studied Martha with new respect. This woman had lived for months with a professional killer without losing her courage or her moral compass. She had risked her life to expose Marcus's crimes and save her community. If anyone could help him stop the remaining conspirators, it would be someone with her combination of intelligence, determination, and intimate knowledge of the enemy's plans. "Tell me what you know," Patterson said, beginning to reload his weapon while keeping a watchful eye on their surviving prisoners. Every detail could make the difference between success and catastrophe. Martha's response revealed the depth of her observation and the careful attention she had paid to Marcus's preparations over the past weeks. She had not only identified the locations where his Confederates were positioned, but had also noted their patrol patterns, their preferred escape routes, and the specific roles each man played in the overall conspiracy. Working together, Martha and Patterson developed a plan that might allow them to prevent the massacre despite their limited time and resources. It was a desperate strategy that required precise timing and considerable luck, but it offered their only hope of saving Copper Ridge from destruction. As they prepared to implement their plan, neither Martha nor Patterson could have predicted that the truth about Marcus Brennan's identity would prove to be even more shocking than anything they had already discovered, or that the full scope of his criminal organization would extend far beyond anything they had imagined possible. The final confrontation with Marcus' Confederates would reveal connections to territorial politics and business interests that transformed a local crime into evidence of corruption that reached the highest levels of Colorado government, and Martha's courage in exposing these crimes would ultimately lead to investigations that saved dozens of other settlements from similar fates. But in that moment, as midnight approached and explosives waited to claim innocent lives, Martha and Patterson focused on the immediate task at hand, stopping a massacre and ensuring that justice would finally catch up with one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in the American frontier. The next 30 minutes would determine whether Copper Ridge survived to see another dawn, and whether Martha's daughter would grow up in a world where courage and determination could still triumph over evil and corruption. Their desperate race against time began as the clock struck 11:30, with less than 30 minutes to locate and stop professional killers who had been planning their attack for months. The odds were against them, but Martha had already proven that sometimes determination and moral courage could overcome seemingly impossible circumstances. The final chapter of the Copper Ridge conspiracy was about to unfold, and its resolution would determine not only the fate of a small mining settlement, but also the future of law enforcement efforts throughout the Colorado Territory. Martha's decision to risk everything for her community was about to pay dividends that extended far beyond anything she could have imagined. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. The truth about Marcus Brennan's organization led to one of the largest criminal investigations in territorial history, proving that even in the most remote corners of the frontier, justice could still prevail when ordinary people found the courage to fight back against extraordinary evil. See you in the next video.